Thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to chat through. I think there's a lot I could cover. Grazing management is a pretty big topic, so there's a lot I could cover. So I've tried to really distill down kind of key points and just tie it into the pastoral system, and also touch a little bit on the importance of measuring and the benefits it can bring us. For those who don't know me, I work as an independent consultant, working mostly in beef and sheep systems, looking at grazing management and sustainable livestock systems as well. As Tabitha suggested, previously with Quality Meat Scotland, running their grazing groups for 5.5 years. And I also do facilitation as well, and currently facilitating the Northumberland AHDB beef and lamb monitor farm. And I should say, actually, also I farm myself in Perthshire, and I work with Innovis. I'm not a breeding partner, but I grow on tup lambs for Innovis as part of their programme. Brilliant. Tabitha, if you want to move on to what would have been the next slide. So I think probably also really important to mention in this first picture, it just goes to show that there's actually lots of different types of grazing system, and I think we've seen a real change of that over the last few years. And this probably, for some people, might put the bit of fear amongst, but it's probably what I would call more mob grazing. This is actually on an arable unit where they're looking to use livestock to help try and improve soil carbon levels and soil health. And if you move on, Tabitha, thank you. And yeah, so the previous picture really also, it's not really aiming for all that feed to be going into the cattle beast. It's about some of that feed going into the soil. This is a different unit, but cattle as well. And this is probably more intensive Kiwi style rotational grazing, where a lot more of the focus is about utilisation. So we're obviously in much smaller grass swards, much shorter grass swards as we're coming through, and there's more of that grass going into the livestock. And I think also just wanted to put this picture up because also there's a bit of a reflection of there's all sorts of different landscape types and different land types, so which also impacts on how people can manage their grazing. Thank you, Tabitha. You want to move on? And probably it's also important just to say that, grazing management is actually, and managing grazing is actually part of a complex system. And ultimately, as livestock producers, we're really just to maximise kilos of live weight production per hectare, or if you're in dairy, kilos of milk solid per hectare. And that's a function, we're putting grass into an animal, which is a function of the amount of pasture consumed, but also of the amount of pasture that actually gets converted into product. Really what we're discussing here, what we're focusing on here, is actually about that pasture consumed as well, and about how much pasture you can grow. You may also grow forage crops. You may also be needing or have some reliance on purchase feed, which could impact on how much pasture you're consuming, and then purchase fertilizer as well. Obviously, on the other side, we've got more of the animal side, and there's things like reproductive efficiency, live weight gain, pregnancy rate, survivals, particularly lamb survival if you're in sheep systems, and weaning weight. So really what I want to show, grazing and grazing management also sits as part of a wider system in terms of how we maximise it. If you want to move on, Tabitha, thank you. And hopefully everyone's kind of aware of this kind of diagram, which really reflects when we're talking about grazing management. And whatever your system, there's a key fundamental about rest periods within it. And if we're starting at the left-hand side of the diagram, and this is pretty much after a grass plant. And this is always used with the ryegrass plant, which is the kind of classic example of understanding how this works. But the theory works for all plants that we graze. But if you're looking at the left-hand side, just after grazing, we can see that sugar stores, water-soluble carbohydrates, they decline because we've effectively removed the plant's ability through taking that leaf off and an animal grazing it, we've actually removed some of the ability of the plant to be able to generate its own energy. So it's reliant on what it has in stores, normally in kind of the stubble areas, or it could be in root area, depending on the plant. And then this energy store declines and is used to be able to put up that next leaf, the first leaf up. And once these leaves start to come up and we get more leaf area, we're obviously starting then to allow the plant can generate its own food through photosynthesis, through maximizing its leaf area. And over time, then the plant is capable and able to replenish those root reserves. And really, that's why we need this rest period. This rest period allows the plant to replenish its root reserves and then be able to cope or to deal with that grazing pressure as we go through. And again, as I said, so the same principle applies for all sorts of different plants, and particularly we see more herbal leys and things, and it still applies for plants like chicory and plantain. And the main difference really being between these kind of plants is actually the time that it's required for those plants to replenish those root reserves. So for ryegrass, middle of summer, it can be 21 days, even shorter. It could be about 18 days. But normally we would talk about a rotation of at least 40 days for some of those herbs in the herbal ley and things. But that's the key principle. And it's about providing a rest period, which all grazing management systems do, basically through controlling the management of livestock, whether that's with electric fencing or just having larger mobs that allow you to utilise fields a bit more effectively. Thanks, Tabitha, if you want to add. Yeah. But yeah, it's a real challenge. Managing grazing is pretty challenging. And one of the key challenges is really just that obviously grass growth isn't the same throughout the season. And this green line here is really showing what, and much like as Tara had demonstrated as well in terms of that carbon graph, is really just how that grass growth is working. So very little grass growth in the winter, and that tends to leave, because we have a certain number of livestock on a unit, that tends to leave us in a deficit over winter, i.e. we don't grow enough grass to be able to supply that full winter period. And then obviously once we hit spring, moving into late spring, we tend to have a surplus because we have more pasture than is required for our stocking rates. And this graph really shows the blue curve is actually the demand curve for a spring calving suckler herd. And it's really how we manage this difference throughout the year, which determines how effective we are at being able to use the pasture that we grow. And so you'll see in the middle of the summer there, big surplus. So we can deal with that through making forage, hay or silage. You could also take a block out and put it into forage crop, such as fodder beet or turnips, which will allow you to reduce that supply over summer and start to shift it into that winter time when we have a deficit. Okay, if you want to move on to the next slide, Tabitha, thank you. And yeah, quite important. And I think, again, depending on your grazing system, but it's one of the other challenges really about maintaining grass quality. And I think particularly if you're in systems such as dairy and sheep systems, where there's probably more need for higher quality pasture, that also becomes a real challenge. Because plants, and particularly grass plants, really want to be reproductive. So we find in late spring that even with good grazing management, those plants are actually increasing their fibre and their lignin content as they're trying to put that stem up to be able to be reproductive. But equally, as that happens, we find that the energy, protein, vitamin and mineral content of the pasture plant declines. Pretty well all grasses, even more sort of native grasses and grasses like Yorkshire fog, are actually really high quality in this early spring period when they're really in that kind of vegetative growth stage, i.e. they're still just putting out nice leafy material, but it's once they start to go reproductive that we start to lose that quality. And that is a real challenge. And also, though, it shows some of the benefit of other plants within our pastures, such as clovers and herbs, such as plantain and chicory, because they tend to maintain their quality further into the summer, whereas grass is a real challenge to manage. Okay, Tabitha, thank you. So yeah, and that challenge, I suppose, as well, is just indicated by this kind of diagram, which, there's a difference between the maximum yield of digestible dry matter, so that's that lower curve on the graph, and that's really when the quality of the pasture just remains high until pretty much for grasses that late boot stage, so just as that head's starting to appear, or in the case of legumes, it's once those first flowers start to appear. And beyond that, the quality, the digestibility of the pasture will decline a bit. But it's also that challenge, and I think if you're under a different grazing system, such as tall grass or mob grazing system, you can allow those pasture plants to go beyond that, and you can be maximising the total plant yield. Okay, so it's gone into seed formation, but you probably have slightly different aims and objectives of that, and are also probably utilising that with suckler cows in that kind of system. Okay, next slide, please, Tabitha. Perfect. Great. So spring, yeah, spring, great time of year. And as I said, I think one of the great things about dealing with spring is that all pasture plants are pretty well vegetative. They are all really high quality and really great feed for ruminants. And it's just that really nice time of year when things can really start to rock, particularly after having a winter probably of supplements, or having them on different forage crops and things. But equally, it's a real challenge. And as it's suggested, particularly with grasses and things, they really want to be heading, and it's, it isn't very long before they're starting to want to put out head, and quality can start to decline quite quickly. The other thing I like about spring, and these kind of, particularly these first rotations in spring, and as you can see on the right hand side of the fence, which has been grazed, you feel like an awesome farmer because you tend to have these really nice residuals. I mean, it's almost like you've gone over with a mower, and it's partly because the stock are willing and happy to eat all the way down. There tends to not be at that time of year any kind of areas that are discarded because they have urine or dung patches, etc., etc. But it's an important time of year just to kind of be on top of your grazing management. I think as well, you need to be getting on and grazing as soon as possible. But that still needs to be within balance for your average farm cover. You don't want to be grazing before you've got your target average farm cover in the spring, because all you're going to do is eat into what you have available. Spring grass tends to, in most of our systems, be coming at a time of year when we really need it for lactation, which is a time of really high demand. And if we want to minimize concentrate feed inputs, then having your spring grass aimed at supporting lactation gives a pretty good return of investment. And also, as I suggested, just because the plant wants to become vegetative, it wants to start to put that seed head up, it's a time of year where it's really important to graze, and you can graze down to that 4 to 5 centimetre height, because it then sets up your future, the next rotation, the time you come back, you should still have a little bit more quality, a bit more leafiness behind that. So that's really important as well, just to make sure that you can hit that residual. Also, if you have the kind of system where you have fields set aside for silage, it's also okay to graze these fields in the spring as well. You tend not to get a silage yield reduction penalty in doing this, because this is saying about grazed grass grows grass, and there seems to be a kind of trigger when grass is grazed that actually it stimulates growth a bit. So people who do that initial graze before then shutting off for silage tend to find that they don't get a yield penalty on the silage. So it's a great way just to reset fields and just to then get a nice even residual across the farm. And also, as I said, that's really high value feed at that time of year. Okay. I think as well, I just really wanted to tie in as well part of what the pastoral project's been looking at in terms of providing data or managing. So if you move on to the next one, please, Tabitha, thank you. Okay, so these are slides that are coming from a farm in New Zealand, who are their dairy farm, who are trialing regenerative versus conventional grazing systems on their dairy. It's worthwhile. They're putting all their data online, and they're measuring a lot of stuff, including finances. So you'll see in the bottom of that slide www.alignfarms.co.nz. I recommend if you're quite into looking at different grazing systems, just to log on occasionally and just see where they're at. But I just wanted to demonstrate. So this first slide here shows, so the green line is the conventional grazing system, and the black is the regenerative grazing system. And this graph is just showing the growth rates throughout the season. And as you can see, they're pretty well matched. So pasture growth rate looks pretty similar under both systems. But if Tabitha flicks on to the next slide, so this measure is the daily production per cow. And as you can see, now obviously they're on the other side of the world. So October for them is like late spring, moving into early summer. But you can see at the red arrow that they've actually had a drop off of production under the regenerative system. So they're growing the same amount of grass as we saw from the earlier graph, but they're actually showing a reduction in daily production per cow. And if Tabitha flicks on to the next slide, and here we can see, so this to me really kind of shows the value in how to deal with data. And here we've got the average farm cover, and you can see around about that same time as cow production dropped, there was also this increase in average farm cover. So effectively, pasture quality is declining and having a bit of an impact on production. So I think it's quite a nice way to demonstrate that, yeah, the measures, you need a certain amount of data that helps you to kind of unpick where and if issues are arising. But as I said, it is worth it. If you're interested, log on to Align Farms and you'll see there's financial data and all sorts of other things on there as well, which is really useful. So if you move on to the next slide, please, Tabitha. Yeah. Okay. And yeah, as kind of alluded to in Tara's presentation, one of the reasons to gather data and to be measuring is also to get a bit of a heads up if you're heading into surplus or deficit. And I think with the last few summers we've had, when we have had dry periods, it's really useful to know how to deal with a deficit, because we're really starting to see a change in our grass growth curves, and yeah, we kind of really need to have tools and ideas of how to manage, particularly in deficit and particularly in the summer. So next slide, please, Tabitha. So the first question on this is really, is the surplus or deficit expected or unexpected? And by this, I mean, because we're at the mercy of the weather, but equally there are some management decisions we can make about how we maximize our use from grass. So this first slide shows, in the red dotted line is the demand. So this is for a low ground sheep system, a 70 kilo ewe bring twins, and lambing on the 1st of March. So the green line obviously is grass supply. So ideally we want to see that red line always under the green, because that means that we always have sufficient pasture available for production. But obviously you can see with the lambing on 1st of March, we've got this January, February, March period, even going into April, where there isn't sufficient supply to meet demand. But if Tabitha flicks through to the next slide. So same data, but this is lambing on the 1st of April. And we can see there's obviously now a much closer match between the red and the green line. And yeah, during winter, we'll always be in deficit. But we can just see that I think it's quite a nice demonstration of how we can have a degree of management of how to deal with surpluses and deficits just through things like lambing or calving dates. Okay, so that's what I mean by expected or unexpected. We can fix that one. So Tabitha, if you move on to the next one, please. Yeah, the challenge is really when we kind of get unexpected deficits. So like the summers that we've been having that, yeah, really struggling for pasture growth when normally in a temperate climate, we would expect to have pretty good pasture growth. So some of the strategies that you can have to tackle that is, yeah, purchase supplementary feed or rent in additional grazing. So the positives of that, obviously, you're putting more supply in. Purchase feed also gives you quite a lot of feeding control, i.e. it's a pretty consistent product and you know exactly the ME, the dry matter, the crude protein content. And yeah, all purchase feed is a high cost per kilo of dry matter versus grazed grass. So it's, yeah, not sure why I've got that actually in a positive, but it is a higher cost. The negatives, obviously, as well, supplementary feed now is as most people are probably aware, is becoming increasingly expensive. You also need to factor in that cost of feeding out. So there's your time involved in actually being able to put supplement out for livestock. And rent grazing, you will probably also have a travel cost involved in that. And there's also the challenge of neighbouring farms and potential animal health risk issues. Okay, next slide, please, Tabitha. Yeah, if you hit deficit as well. So another strategy you can use is fertiliser. So positives, again, by using fertiliser, you're actually increasing the feed supply. And in the right conditions, i.e. once we've got moisture and if it's warm enough, you'll see a pretty quick response in grass growth. The negatives, again, I don't need to tell everyone here, but fertiliser now is pretty expensive. And also conditions need to be right for that to have a maximum return of investment. So by that, I mean as well, if we're in summer dry, applying fertiliser is not really going to make a huge difference. There will already be nitrates in the soil, which because plants are generally shutting down and are low on water, they're not able to utilise those nitrates as effectively during that kind of drought period. So adding more fert isn't necessarily going to help you when you're summer dry. It may well help you in a late spring, but equally you don't want to be putting it on when soils are too cold. So it's a real use with care, but it is something in the toolbox available. Next one, Tabitha. Yeah, destock is another strategy. So again, rather than increasing supply, which is what we've discussed already, this actually reduces the demand. It gives an opportunity to sell poor performers or anything that's not rearing a calf or a lamb. And it actually may be more cost effective than buying in feed. So see it as an opportunity to reduce. The other thing, some people also have growing stock, which may be reasonably tradable. So I'm thinking of kind of yearling cattle and things that may allow that opportunity to reduce pressure on the grazing platform. Negatives, and obviously if you are selling stock, you don't really want to be hitting the market when everyone else is wanting to sell. So it's one of those things, if you do make the decision to sell, you really want to be doing it ahead of, and taking that decision quite early. And equally, yeah, it could potentially reduce your income. For example, if you're selling lamb store rather than fat, or if you're having to buy in replacements. For example, if you sold more than you would traditionally cull out and you need to apply replacements once pasture production returns, then that can bring in a cost to your system. But again, it's about weighing up all the opportunities and options. Okay, Tabitha, next slide, please. Yeah, another strategy for dealing with a deficit is actually about using body condition score. And I suppose it highlights the value in body condition score, and to a certain degree, quite a lot of suckler systems probably utilise this, where cows put on a lot of condition over the summertime, and then can help, particularly in outwintering systems, that you can rely on some of that body condition to be able to get you through the winter. So positives for beef cattle, each kilo of live weight lost is equivalent to about 28 megajoules of ME. And Ideally, you want to control that weight loss, so controlling that weight loss at 0.5 kilo per day can give you about 14 megajoules of ME per day, which in theory could provide about 20% of their daily energy requirements for a 640 kilo dry cow. The negatives, so obviously it gives us some energy, but for each kilo of live weight gain, it actually requires 55 megajoules. So it is more expensive effectively for that animal to put it on. Physiologically, it's more expensive. But as we've earlier seen in graphs, if you actually have surplus in the summertime, then that is an opportunity when you effectively almost have free grass or surplus grass that you can do that. And also reducing body condition score at key productions times can impact on performance, particularly fertility and also at lactation. So again, it's a decision that you'll need to make depending on where you are in the production cycle, because you don't necessarily want to impact on growth of young stock, particularly if they're still suckling. Thanks, Tabitha. Yeah. And for those in dairy, but equally I would apply to this about weaning or weaning early in suckler or sheep systems. So you can consider drying off or moving to once a day milking. Again, positives, this is all about reducing demand. So because lactation isn't required, you don't need, or less, that you're pushing through to lower levels of lactation, it reduces the demand. It can also effectively reduce your labour input or the total system costs. It also allows you the opportunity then, once the lactation stops, and particularly even we can use this in weaning, to allow cows, or actually ewes, to be able to increase condition. Obviously, the negatives are reduced output, and also it may impact on somatic cell counts. And also adding to that, and certainly about earlier weaning, it's really important if you're weaning lambs or calves reasonably young that you have really high quality pasture to put them onto, because they need that. They're effectively relying on the grass to make up that difference that they would normally getting from milk. So again, it's a kind of use with caution. Thanks, Tabitha. And then, yeah, it's a slightly shorter list for when you have a surplus, but strategies for dealing with a surplus. Opportunity to buy in trading stock. So if you have a kind of system where you can, or you have source of stock that has similar health status to you, then it's always a great way, particularly for growing stock, a great way to be able to put kilos on. So, for example, going to buy some store cattle, just grazing them over the summertime, you can gain kilos on those and effectively gain income from them if that works for you. As most people do in this country, we're going to cut for forage at some stage, so that's always useful. If you are supplementary feeding at all in your system, if you've got a surplus, huge opportunity to stop feeding supplements. And I'll probably particularly mention lamb creep feeders for that. Also, we have the opportunity, and we're seeing a lot of people now starting to defer pastures over summertime for feeding into the autumn and winter. So that's a great opportunity to be able to deal with it in a really low cost way. The other thing is to utilise that time of year to be able to reseed or to establish a forage crop and effectively shift some dry matter into the winter, particularly with winter hardy forage crops. As we'd mentioned with body condition score, allow body condition score to increase, particularly I think in suckler cow systems, that you effectively are banking some of that energy that's come out of your pastures and dealing with the surplus. Okay, Tabitha, next slide, please. Yeah. So really just in a little bit of summary, the opportunity in managing your grazing, because we have a bit of grazing control and you're allowing pasture plants to have that rest period, it actually allows you to be able to grow more grass. Also allows you to be able to therefore increase your stocking rate. So you can run more stock over the same area of land, because effectively through good management, you are growing more pasture. Depending on your system as well, as we mentioned, it allows you to utilise more grass. So you have a little bit more control than you do in a continuous grazing system, where stock kind of have a free choice. And by controlling the grazing means that you're actually, you're aiming for those nice target residuals, but it's allowing you to utilise as much grass as possible. Also gives you the opportunity, and certainly this is becoming quite a hot topic, about extending the grazing systems, particularly in cattle systems, where one of the biggest costs is in wintering. So as we mentioned earlier about deferred grazing, this is a great way just to be able to extend the grazing season, particularly on those shoulders. Also, the opportunity to use less nitrogen, or to use the same amount of nitrogen much more effectively. So you can be more strategic in your nitrogen use. And also, if you are growing more grass and you maybe haven't necessarily increased stocking rate, then that's an opportunity perhaps to pull out nitrogen in your system. Also allows, in a similar vein, to be able to substitute purchase feed with grazed grass, and certainly starting to see that in some sheep systems where people are reducing, particularly even pre-lambing, reducing reliance on purchase feed through a pre-lambing rotation. Also allows you to maintain sward quality for longer. So as I suggested earlier, is about trying to maintain that pasture quality by reducing the plant's desire to head and to have leafier grass, which just means that you're putting higher quality pasture into the animal. And also, allows potentially managed grazing can allow you to support biodiversity. And I suppose that's also heading towards more of the mob or tall grass grazing as well. Is we're starting to see some good data and evidence that it can support biodiversity. Next slide, Tabitha, thank you. So it sounds as if a lot of you were already undertaking some form of managed grazing, but give it a go and actually enjoy it. It's a great way to make a big change on your farm and to maintain profitability, and lots of people doing it who enjoy the challenge and the benefits from it. Thank you, Tabitha.
There we go, struggling to get back onto the screen. That was brilliant. Thank you, Emily. I know we've had a couple of questions in the chat as we've gone. Please feel free to add either more to the chat or which we've got one straight away, or if you want to pop your hand up and ask Emily straight away, you can. The one from the chat we've got at the moment, Emily, is from Doug Christie. Are there any benefits of letting a sward of good composition but thin go to seed and then use high density grazing to trample the seed into the ground? So kind of effectively, can you reseed in that manner?
Yeah. Hi, Doug. Well, I think there is, and I think there's obviously benefits of the pasture plants that are on your farm and are getting to seed are ones that are working effectively on your farm as well. So I think it probably does have benefit. I have herbal lays on the farm, and I've certainly allowed after year, I cut silage in its second year and then just left that herbal lay to drop seed. Which has certainly left, particularly plantain has come through well as effectively self-seeded, as have the clovers, particularly red clover, because as you're probably aware, persistency of some of these forbs within mixed species swards is quite challenging. But obviously that still needed to be balanced. So it depends on your grazing system, but that needs to be balanced, that you obviously have this period where you're not making that pasture available because you want to let it to go to seed. And then you also need the right class of stock to be able to graze it afterwards. There's some really good work in New Zealand, Doug. I don't know if you're aware of it, that Catherine Tozer has been doing, and it's looking at hill country pastures where reseeding is really tricky, where they are deferring over summer period to allow it to set seed and try and just maintain that pasture quality. I don't know, Tabitha, if we can somehow get a link to that work out to people. I might try and have a hunt, but yeah, they're finding it really effective over summer period, closing off for about 6 weeks and allowing that reseed to happen, and then grazing it. I think they're grazing with R1 dairy heifers, so it's not a huge feed demand off of them, but really tidying it up, grazing it well down, and they're seeing good results afterwards, and even in clovers coming back on that as well.
That's great, thanks Emily. One of the questions, can we share your slides afterwards, is that all right?
Of course, Tabitha, you've got them there as a PDF, so yeah, feel free just to take.
So they'll go round, we'll send an email round after the meeting with kind of any of these bits of information and stuff in, so we'll include the slides in there. Bill's next question, is the persistency problem due to inappropriately grazing, basically? Is it too frequent, too intensive, or the rotation not being correct?
Yeah, particularly herbal lays in particular, and chicory plantain, they are just slightly different plants. It's a real challenge and a head scratch to be able to manage. And I find I'm using them in sheep systems, and sheep are really pretty selective grazers. So after first spring grazing on a herbal lay, they will take the grasses. And they'll graze those happily. Once you're onto the next rotation, they're pretty well purely just wanting to take clovers, chicory and plantain. So it becomes a real challenge to balance that grazing pressure, because all they'll do is then graze out those herbs really, really hard. And the challenge with the herbs is that their growing point is much higher than many of the grasses, particularly ryegrass. So you've got this kind of double whammy of the herbs are the ones you want to leave longer, but you ideally want to graze the grasses a little bit shorter. But in reality, it just doesn't happen because they're too selective. So you need to make sure you've got a longer rest period, so at least 40 days. You need to not graze down too hard. In New Zealand, certainly they're grazing down to about 8 centimetres. So it's still quite tall. Caveat that with in New Zealand, they actually don't put grasses into the herbal lay. They are just clovers, chicory and plantain. And I've been trialing that at home. I've got a strip which is just chicory, plantain and the red and white clover. And in terms of sheep production, I do find it easier to manage because you don't have this issue with the grasses not being grazed throughout the summer, and these grasses then lignifying and becoming even less palatable as you go through. So it's a real kind of suck at the sea. The other thing is you just make an assumption that they're a bit like growing red clover, which we've known for years. It's just that they don't persist. And you make sure that within that mix you've got ryegrass and white clover. And eventually what will happen is that after about a year or 3 or 4, the herbs probably won't be there in any great number, but you end up with a nice ryegrass, white clover sward at the end of it. So again, it's that balance between how long in the rotation does that lay need to be in for, and if you want it longer term, I do wonder if that's the best way, that you just have ryegrass and white clover in it, and you just allow those herbs to ease out. So yeah, I think we're still learning a lot about herbal lays, but they are awesome feed. They really are.
What he's commented that easier with cattle then, but I suppose as another, is there, partly my question, is there a better time kind of actually if you've got both, if you've got sheep and cattle, is there times when actually it's better to put the cattle on or there's better to put the sheep on?
Yeah, probably. As I said, I think sheep early doors, early rotation, and actually something else I should have said in that I wouldn't really graze them in the winter. So a bit like red clover as well, be avoiding going, depending on where you're on the country, but going beyond that kind of 1st of November, maybe 1st of December where you are. They don't like cold weather. They will disappear with frosts. It happens in nature as well. You know, we see a lot of these plants disappear. But as soon as you start grazing, you're still grazing in the winter, you're causing an issue with them. Yes, probably easier with cattle. They'll give you a nicer residual height, unlike sheep. So if I had cattle, I would have been putting cattle on later in the summer to be able to manage those grasses, because I've also put cocksfoot in, which yeah, a bit of a challenge with sheep to get them to eat that. If I had cattle, it would be much easier to manage. So yeah, that's a really good point, Bill. Again, these herbal lays depend on your system and what stock you've got to graze with them.
Great, thank you, Emily. We are 3 minutes over time now, but I did think this might happen when we had so many people online. If you do have any more questions, we can probably do a couple more if you want to pop your hand up or pop it in the chat. If not, feel free to send them to us afterwards, and we can always follow up on them. Hopefully, you've been interested in the project today and appreciated Emily's time. So thank you, Emily, for joining us. It's been really good. I think you'll probably get, I think it'll have been asked when you signed up, you'll be added to the project mailing list now, something you can always unsubscribe from, but if it has interested you, then you'll get kind of newsletter updates from that. Oh, we've got somebody just coming in again now. It's a bit late. So yeah, so you'll get an email afterwards just from attending this evening, and we'll try and answer kind of any of these questions or share any of the information that we've said we would, and then you'll be added onto the mailing list as well. But please do get in touch with us if you've got any further questions, or if you want to sign up for the project and stuff. Tara can get you all onboarded and get you involved with getting data back about your grass as well. But otherwise, I think it's just a big thank you from us, and enjoy the rest of your evening.